Okay, so let's have a look at example 1. Writing this down. Example 1 says to evaluate, so to work out. So part A, it asks us to work out what is 6 squared. So 6 to the power of 2. So you go, well, 6 squared means 6 times 6, and 6 times 6 is 36. So you're done. Part B says, what is the square root of 64? So you're thinking to yourself, what squared gives me 64? Because the opposite of square root is squaring. So what times itself is 64? Now, if you don't know immediately, that's okay. It might help you to write out your list of square numbers on the side. So 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 6 squared, 7 squared, 8 squared, 9 squared, 10 squared, gave the answer away, etc. So you can help yourself. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 times 5 is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared is 49, 8 squared is 64, 9 squared is 81, 10 squared is 100, etc. So if you don't know the answer immediately to the square root of 64, that's okay. Write on the side your square numbers and then go, okay, what squared gives me 64? Well, this is 64, and 8 squared gives me 64. So we can write that the square root of 64 equals 8. And that's all you need to write, because 8 squared is 64, and the opposite of square rooting is squaring, or vice versa. So square root of 64 equals 8. Now let's do a little bit harder one, a bigger number. So C says, what is the square root of 1,600? So that's a big number, right? So how do we work out what this is? Well, if you know the answer already, good for you. Well, you're asking yourself, what squared gives you 1,600? Well, I mean, if you look at your list of square numbers, it would take us a long time to list out all the square numbers, because only 10 squared is 100, right? It could go on forever and ever. So the trick here is, well, think of 1,600, yeah? Now you look at the end, there's 2 zeros, and you go, well, I know 10 squared is 100. Can I break this number down into something times 100? Well, 16 hundredths is 16 times 100, right? So I'm thinking, well, the square root of 100 is 10. Is 16 a square number? Is something squared gives me 16? Well, if you look at your list, you go, hey, 4 squared is 16 and 10 squared is 100. So I can break this down into 4 and 10. So the square root of 1,600 is just 40, because the square root of 16 is 4, and then the square root of 100 is 10, and then 4 times 10 is equal to 40. So that's one way of thinking about it, is to break it down into its factors, square factors. So if you have a big number, say, and then the number ends with 2 zeros, then it's a multiple of 100, and you know the square root of 100 is 10. Well, what times 100 gives you 16 hundredths? Well, 16. Well, what then is the square root of 16? 4. So your final answer is 4 times 10, which gives you 40. So that's the answer there. Let's do one more, part D. The square root of 2,500. Again, it's a big number, so let's see if we can break it down into smaller numbers. So you're thinking, okay, 2,500, it ends with 2 zeros, so I can break it down into something times 100. Well, 25 times 100 gives me 2,500, or 25 hundredths. Well, then you're thinking, well, what is the square root of 25, and what is the square root of 100? Square root of 25 is 5, because you can see that on your list, and you know 5 squared is 25. And square root of 100 is 10, because 10 squared is 100. So what is the square root of 2,500? Well, then it's 5 times 10, which is 50. So in your answer, you just write 50. So on the side here, on the side here, this will be more of your side calc thinking space. And then over here in the black is what you would write as your final answer.